All right, well, good evening, everyone. Sorry for us being a few minutes late. We are experiencing some technical difficulties getting our YouTube live stream going. But my name is Melanie Galante. I am the Professional Development and Curriculum Coordinator at Bi-County Collaborative, and I want to welcome everyone tonight to our workshop with Dr. Craig Murphy, Understanding the Mental Health Implications of COVID for Students and Preparing for a Return to Normalcy. And what a timely event to have. When we were planning this, we weren't expecting students to be returning into school full time, starting this week with elementary, and of course with the secondary starting at the end of the month. So this is such a timely event for us, and we are really excited to have it. This event is actually open to several of our member districts. Bi-County Collaborative, we service districts for special education. We have 19 member districts. And so we have parents from all over the state that are going to be joining us through Zoom and through YouTube. This is being recorded tonight so that we can share this later on with parents that are unable to attend. However, we will stop the recording at the question and answer session at the end of this presentation so that you can answer your questions and they will not be publicized. I want to thank King Philip for allowing us to use their technology tonight. Thank you for setting it up. Your microphones throughout this presentation will stay on mute. However, you can ask questions in the chat. There is also a Q&A, so either one of those will work, and I will be keeping track of those questions and sharing those with Dr. Murphy at the end of this presentation. This is being recorded, and this will be able to be translated once it's recorded through closed caption capabilities on YouTube. I will be sharing out these links and how to do that via email and through the districts. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Craig Murphy, and he will be presenting the presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Melanie. I did get a couple of messages, so I just want to make sure people are getting allowed in, because I got a couple of messages saying people were in the waiting room, so I don't know if that's something we have to actively monitor. Well, thanks for having me again. This is the graphic I wanted to start with. For those of you with kids or working in schools, it has been a long 12 months with COVID. It felt like 5 years. And some of these visuals I thought were kind of a funny way to start, thinking about kids being asked, what have they been doing for the last 12 months? Kids in districts preparing to return to some kind of normalcy. I've seen firsthand what recesses looked like. I was in an elementary school in Worcester this morning, and seeing how they have prepared to come back, and schools are doing an amazing job. It's been really challenging to figure out how do we keep up with these changing demands and the expectations for teachers and kids, and families just don't know what to expect. So it's one of the goals for tonight. I want to talk a little bit about my background, just so you can have a sense of the perspective I'm coming from with this presentation. I'm a psychologist by training. I've been working in schools for the last 20 years, specializing really with working with students and their families who struggle with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. So the last 12 months have seen a significant increase, which we'll be talking about. But it's been interesting for me to see how some of these presentations have changed over the years, and over this last 12 months in particular. I'm also a professor at William James College in their school psychology program. And the reason why I mention that is because in that role, I teach a lot of our classes around statistics and research. So I have been staying informed with the research about COVID and the impacts on mental health. So I'll be sharing a lot of that data with you tonight as well. I'm also the clinical director of the Summit program at BICO. So our program, we have about 80 kids who have all been placed out of district for different reasons. Most of them struggle with different emotional or behavioral challenges. And we've actually been in person since October. So we are one of the few programs that's been open 5 days a week for most of the school year. And we have done a lot of things really well, and we've made some mistakes that we've learned from, and we've had a lot of challenges. And so we'll be talking a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned in terms of being in person learning. And that's included having to go remote multiple times, responding to the different demands and needs of COVID. So we'll share some of those. I'm also the owner of the Family and Educational Wellness Center in Franklin. And the reason why I share that is because we have been flooded with referrals for mental health needs in kids and families. So we have really struggled to keep up with the demand, as have a lot of psychologists and mental health professionals. And so I see firsthand how the mental health demands and how the demands around COVID have affected kids' mental health. And so we'll talk a lot about that. I'm also the parent of 4 kids. My kids are in the King Philip district. I live in the area. My youngest is 3rd grade. My oldest. Can people hear me okay? Um, so, sorry, I just got interrupted by being muted, so I wanted to make sure people can hear me. But I was sharing the story with a junior in high school who also had COVID, and I had mentioned that I couldn't see, I couldn't smell or taste, and he looked at me and goes, "Oh, it might be a good time for you to lose some weight." So that was a good wake up call for me, and good to see kids haven't lost their sense of humor despite COVID. There are a few hot topics, things we're not going to talk about tonight. So I just want to go through those quickly because I'd say a couple of these things are a little bit out of bounds or not on the agenda. So we're certainly not going to talk about any of these controversial issues that took up most of the fall. We're probably not going to talk about social distancing requirements, whether that's 6 feet or 3 feet. I have seen the long lines at Target and also some of the self-quarantine guidelines in terms of whether it's 10 days or 14 days or 12 days, or if you test positive, if you don't test positive. I know working in schools, these issues are certainly well outside of my area of expertise, but I've probably spent more time talking about COVID in meetings in the last 12 months than anything else. So please know that schools are trying really hard to keep up with all these different changing demands. Probably also going to pass on this debate. I don't know how many people follow baseball. I'm not a huge baseball fan, but opening day in Texas this week had 40,000 fans, a little bit different than what we're used to. If you compare that to the Super Bowl that had about, I think it was 22,000 fans, so it looked like an empty stadium. So we're seeing a lot of these things change. Mostly, these are great signs, but I think it also raises anxiety. Do have some stronger feelings about this debate. This was a tough thing for us to follow and accept during COVID, but a lot of strong feelings in New England about the changing faces of the New England Patriots and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But what I want to cover, and the goal of tonight's talk, is one, defining the scope of the problem. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means for schools, what that means for COVID. Second one is, I'm sorry, went too fast here. Second one is examining the impact of the pandemic on families. So we'll talk specifically about how that's affected families and family systems. Number 3, examining the impact of the pandemic on specific mental health challenges and learning challenges. And then finally, preparing students and families for a return to normalcy. So we'll talk about that as well. When we talk about the scope of the problem, this is from the American Psychological Association talking about the percentage of people reporting that they have very or somewhat significant sources of stress in their lives related to these issues. So again, 74% of families or people are worrying about family members getting coronavirus. So we saw this primarily in the older generation, especially last year when we talked about some of the elder homes in the rising rates of COVID. 74% of people reported significant stress about how the government is responding to coronavirus. So regardless of where you sit politically, I think a lot of us were concerned. Were we prepared to handle this? Did we know how to respond? Were we over responding? Were we under responding? There's a lot of stress all along the continuum. 74% disrupted routines, adjusting to new routines. So a lot of us, again, especially for kids and families and students, we rely on routines and we rely on structures to help navigate the daily demands that we face. And so when those are completely disrupted or eliminated, that really creates a lot of stress for families. Getting coronavirus. managing distance and online learning for children. So now all of a sudden we have families and parents who are dealing with their own professional stress and then being expected to take on the learning demands of their kids, and not knowing how to do that. And not only that, for parents and for educators, being expected to pivot to remote learning with about 48 hours notice. So it was pretty miraculous what schools were able to accomplish. And that's not to suggest that they did things perfectly, but the demands facing schools and students was unlike anything we've ever seen. More importantly, families worrying about, are they going to be able to meet their basic needs, availability of and access to food and housing. I've worked with a lot of families over the last 12 months dealing with issues around homelessness and shelters closing and other housing opportunities not available to them these past 12 months. People talking about self-isolation, access to healthcare services, missing out on major milestones. So that's where the invention of the drive-by birthday parties, seeing their parents or not being able to see their parents. So all of these protective factors that help a lot of families survive were taken away from them. So that was obviously a big challenge. Another statistics looks at which age groups are getting hit the hardest. Interestingly here, and I know we're here to talk about school age kids, but the age group of 18 to 24, 75% reporting at least one mental health problem. Typically, this number hovers around 25% to 33%. So it's tripled over the last 12 months of COVID. The young adults and a lot of our parents fall into that next category. So over 50% of 25 to 44. So younger parents. Older parents and then that next generation about 30%, so almost 1 in 3, and then over 65%, we're talking about 15% of people reporting at least one mental health problem. Specifically around COVID's mental health, we saw in the UK, we saw rates about a year ago of 10% double to 20% reporting symptoms of depression. If we think about symptoms of anxiety and or depression, 11% becomes 42%, so quadrupled. If we really pick apart depression in depression rates among the US population specifically, you'll see the overall rates of 51% to 63% of normal. What the biggest rates here is overall depression rates increasing by 12%, moderate levels of depression have doubled, and significant or severe levels of depression have increased by 900%. Now, what I've learned by trying to stay in touch with the research or stay familiar with the research is the numbers are constantly changing. So have the rates doubled? Have they tripled? Have they quadrupled? It's going to depend what your data source is. But what is consistent across all of these sources of information is that mental health issues have risen dramatically over the last 12 months across the age groups. So if we talk a little bit more about the data, so anxiety disorders 300%, depression 400%, suicidal ideation has increased 200% in adults. COVID is disproportionately affecting young adults, minorities, essential workers, unpaid caregivers for adults, those already receiving treatment for pre-existing psychiatric conditions. The risk factors for substance abuse have also dramatically increased. So now when we think about depression, when we think about social isolation, leading and triggering substance abuse relapse, or the development of maladaptive substance abuse behaviors, all of those things are in play now because of these last 12 months. More than 58% of college students reported that their mental health has declined since the beginning of the pandemic. So again, I don't mean to go back to the statistics again and again and again, but I think I want to kind of arrive at a consensus that about 80% of children with mental health disorders are not receiving treatment. So the consensus is, can we all agree that there's a problem? And again, this is a lot harder to do virtually because this is when I usually rely on nonverbal communication to communicate back to me that we're all kind of in agreement. To the right, you talk about specific disorders. We'll talk about those and how they're impacted by COVID as well. But I think one of the big things for me here too is when we talk about 80% of children not receiving treatment, and when we think about a lot of these statistics talk about young adults and or older adults, the main concern here is where do most children receive their mental health support or treatment? It's schools. When I talk to my students every year at William James College, I often tell them, there's no better field to go into than school psychology or school adjustment counselors or school mental health, because most kids, the only time they access mental health services is in schools. So when schools were forced to shut down last March, a lot of kids were disconnected from their mental health providers. And even those kids that are fortunate enough to access mental health support outside of school, most of those resources were also eliminated. Although a lot of them were able to pivot to telehealth pretty quickly, still, we're still not sure how effective mental health services are when they're delivered through telehealth, although a lot of the early results are very promising. Again, most kids were cut off from their mental health professionals and a lot of their primary supports. So if we want to talk a little bit about the impact on families, Prime, Wade, and Brown is a 2020 article, which is, did some really great work in terms of understanding this. They talked about a third of families report feeling very or extremely anxious about family stress due to COVID-19 related confinement. Interestingly, we talked about how are we going to learn? How do we prepare? A lot of educators were thinking, what are we going to learn from? Most of us have never lived through, pretty much all of us have never lived through a pandemic. So a lot of the researchers started looking at the Great Depression. They started looking at World War II because this was the magnitude of the disruption to family functioning. So learning from research on acute crises such as natural disasters, economic upheaval, war and terrorism, not because the pandemic or our experiences with COVID-19 were the exact same, but the dramatic impact on daily life and daily functioning was similar. So what researchers said is, well, what did we do well in those situations and what can we learn from? Focus is being placed by a lot of researchers on family well-being. Why are we focusing on the family system? Because what we know is children and adolescents adjustment is largely contingent on the general climate and relationships within a family system. In terms of a proposed framework, what they talked about child adjustment is multiply determined from both distal factors, so social disruptions to COVID, proximal processes, things like that. Oops, sorry. My screen, I'm just going to minimize that so I can see the screen. To proximal processes, so social relationships with others. Daily stressors for caregivers compromise their well-being, which serves as the funnel through which social disruptions to COVID-19 infiltrate the family functioning. So basically what we're talking about here is as the caregivers compromise their well-being, that affects all aspects of the family system. So it affects the marital relationship, if there is one. It affects parent-child relationships. It affects sibling relationships. So all of these things, the interdependent nature of the family, all of these things are compromised due to COVID-19. Some of the mediating family processes, so what do the researchers say that we should be paying attention to? Our communication practices, our overall organization within the family system, our belief systems. Those are some things we're going to be paying attention to and talking about today. Pre-existing family vulnerabilities and protective factors are also critical. So there are a lot of protective factors that if they are in place for your family and for your children, you will experience the COVID-19 or the pandemic differently. So for people that don't have financial stress, that is a protective factor. For families living in poverty, the pandemic is going to impact you in a different way and likely more severely. For families that don't have mental health challenges, that would be another protective factor, whereas families with mental health factors or distresses, that's going to be more difficult. Kids with learning disabilities, kids in families with medical problems, marginalized populations, all of those things are going to change the way that we experience the pandemic or the ways that we have experienced it over the last 12 months. It seems like an arbitrary parallel, but the Great Farm Crisis in the 1980s and a lot of the middle part of the country, it was an interesting parallel because what they learned is that when caregivers are faced with increased levels of stress, so whether that's financial stress or unemployment, what ends up happening is mental and emotional resources are drained. When that happens, parents in general and families, there's an over-reliance on less effective parenting practices. So this is what we'll often refer to as like authoritarian parenting practices or permissive parenting practices. And so if we add on top of that bio or medical stressors or the social consequences of COVID-19, so social restrictions, the lack of social opportunities, that increases our stress even more so. And then on top of that, increasing and new demands on families. So families that are now being asked or required to share space, to adhere to social restrictions, and to attempt to navigate the demands of remote learning. All of these things, you can see why this has been such a stressful time for families and kids. A quote that I really like, stress reveals resiliency and exposes vulnerability, and privilege, both earned and unearned privilege, protects us from stress. So when we know that when we're working with and trying to support families who struggle with resiliency, or families that are experiencing a lot of vulnerable risk factors, we know COVID has likely been extremely hard for them. And then we also want to be aware of privilege, both unearned and unearned, and how that's helped some families navigate the pandemic in different ways. So we talked about family factors. Let's talk specifically about some of the risk factors for families. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the parent-child relationships. So when we think about that, what I would ask parents, if this was more interactive, which of course I wish it was, I would ask parents to talk about or maybe volunteer examples of ways that parent and child relationships have improved and maybe have not improved or have gotten worse. And becoming more aware of that, because what the research suggests is that parent relationships have suffered during COVID. Even though initially a lot of kids especially thought of the initial school closures as being like an extra summer vacation, or getting to spring break early, a lot of excitement, or a lot of people were really enjoying some of those first couple weeks off. And then when they started to realize that cascading effect of losing sports, losing things like the prom, losing things like graduation, losing opportunities to spend time with friends. This really started to take its toll on relationships in general, but especially parent and child relationships. That extended isolation and home confinement. Again, looking around, a lot of you, or probably all of you, are attending this call remotely from home. If you look around your own home environment, some of our home environments are, somewhat relaxing and warm and supportive and comforting. Other families, that's not always the case. So home confinement, again, means a lot of different things to different people. Marital conflict, so extended times, a lot, just as schools were closed, most businesses closed initially, and a significant number of adults were being expected to work from home. That alone, that together time, although there might be some families that continue to enjoy it. But what we know on a greater scale, a larger scale, is these difficulties, COVID exacerbated pre-existing marital problems and created new ones. Sibling relationship quality, so the financial stress and family disorganization is directly linked to sibling hostility and aggression. So for those of you parents at home that are thinking that your kids are fighting more, or maybe they're not being as patient with one another, or maybe they're not being nice to each other, maybe that was true to some extent before COVID, but it's likely increased so dramatically, because now we're talking about 12 months. So sometimes we used to think about how families would, the short car rides would be okay, and then the kids would start, screaming back and forth as the ride extended or was increased. That happens as well in the home environments. So the whole family process, I thought this was an interesting take. It's the most dramatic shift in family functioning since World War II. That really helped me put things into perspective, especially when I work with families and kids, whether it's doing evaluations or in my practice. It helps families to realize why this has been so hard. The basic mechanisms or basic mechanics of daily life have been seriously disrupted. Children are less physically active, poorer sleep hygiene, spend more time on screens than ever before. So these are all dramatic changes in family lives. I'm aware typically when I develop these slides, I have more than I could ever get through. So if I'm going too fast, I'll get that feedback later. I'm also going to talk to Melanie about any slides or questions that come up in the chats, the chat room. So hopefully I'll get to those as well. Another recommendation is, being aware of the 3 R's, so routines, rituals, and rules. Now, this is important for a couple different reasons, because as our entire structure, our sense of organization has dramatically changed in these last 12 months, these are some specific things that we can pay attention to. And what do we know about the importance of routine for kids? Routines are directly linked to language development, academic development, and social skills in children. So the most obvious example, it probably took you a long time to help develop the getting ready for school routine in the morning. So for most of us, that starts when our kids are in kindergarten. And they're usually a little easier to wake up. So a lot of times those kids are getting up before us, but we typically spend some time. And if you have an easy kid who's really well organized, it probably was easier for you. But if you've had a kid that's a little bit more challenging, that routine, helping them establish that, whether they're getting ready, getting dressed, getting their materials ready, eating a meal, some kind of breakfast, maybe watching a quick show, and then getting out ready for the bus. Doing all that in about 20 to 30 minutes, that routine is really helpful to kids. talking to kids through that routine helps foster pro-social language skills. Again, the academic routines, whether it's homework, whether it's morning meeting at school, all of these routines, when kids lose those, there's a long-term impact for that. And the most obvious one is most children have become accustomed to spending anywhere from 6 to 8 hours a day with their peers. And it doesn't mean that these social skills, these social opportunities were always great. Some kids, it was hard for them. But having repeated daily, 5 days a week practice with social skills for kids, having that ripped away from them last March, and most of them not getting it again until October or November, we should not be surprised as parents and as educators that when kids are coming back, there are going to be significant gaps, whether it's language gaps, academic gaps, social gaps, they're going to be there. So we just need to anticipate them and prepare for how we're going to respond. What we know about rituals, so like things like sitting down for family meals, these are predictive of attachment, security, and family cohesion. So if we have seen some of those rituals fade over time, we should not be surprised when we see similar changes in attachment and security and family cohesion. Now, interestingly, a lot of families have talked about over these last 12 months, some of the silver linings or some of the protective factors or some of the things that we want to keep beyond the pandemic. A lot of families I've worked with have said, we've never had so many meals together because so many of the activities, whether it's sports or drama or plays after school, families have had a lot of times to increase family cohesion. So those are some of the things that we want to celebrate, but some families haven't had that experience. And then finally, rules. What rules do for kids is they establish expectations for emotional and relational patterns governing the interactions in a family. Bedtime, curfew, language, video game limits. And I don't want to be hypocritical. I think before pandemic, as a family, as a parent, we were actually doing pretty good here. I have to say, 12 months later, lost control of the video game time. And it was never an intentional decision. But when, as parents, and a lot of you guys are probably in the same boat, when you're juggling all of these different demands, some things have to go. So as we return for normalcy, we want to be aware of things that have maybe slipped over the last 12 months and how are we going to reestablish some of those things. So the next thing we're going to talk about is specifically COVID-19 and the specific mental health challenges or learning challenges that our kids are facing, and why some of these mental health and learning challenges have been exacerbated by COVID-19. So the first one we're going to talk about is depression. So what I've tried to do for these slides, I've tried to talk about on the left hand of the slide, the diagnostic criteria, things that we typically look for when we talk about depression in kids. And then on the right side of the slide, I look at, okay, in what ways has COVID contributed to increasing levels of depression in kids? And just to be clear, most of these things will absolutely generalize to young adults and adults. So when I think about depression, depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure, feelings of sadness, emptiness, hopelessness, weight change, which could be weight loss or weight gain, difficulty sleeping, frequent complaints of fatigue, chronic irritability, especially with younger children. Irritability is almost synonymous with depression. So a lot of times I'll have families say, no, I don't think he's depressed, but he's just constantly in a bad mood, very easily set off. That irritability, that sense of irritability, again, is synonymous with depression in kids. Excuse me. And then diminished ability to concentrate. So if we look at all of those risk factors, and then we think about what COVID has done, at a minimum, social isolation. So if we think about kids, if we're worried about their loss of interest or pleasure, if what we think about what they have experienced for these last 12 months, the social isolation, excuse me, if you map that around along the grade levels, social isolation, the impact of kindergarten, when kids are expecting to learn how to play, expected to learn how to interact with peers. Fast forward that to early elementary grades, first and second grade, when the expectations of reciprocal play start to really increase. Upper middle school, where a lot of the socialization starts to become a lot more meaningful to kids. That transition to middle school has been so challenging for generations, and now kids are just being ripped out of that entirely. So although in the short term, maybe it allowed them to avoid some of those common challenges related to middle school, but those learning opportunities are what kids need. They need to figure out how to navigate those social demands of the middle school environment. So we didn't necessarily, we might have in the short term might have avoided them, but now they're going back with a year of social isolation under their belt, going to be a lot more challenging. So home confinement, how is that going to impact feelings of sadness or emptiness or hopelessness? Loss of activities, how might that affect our weight? For a lot of kids, weight gain, weight loss. Remote learning, talk about diminished ability to concentrate. I'm sure most of you will probably have at least 2 or 3 windows open at the same time right now for this talk. We're creating ADHD in some of our kids with remote learning and that diminished ability to concentrate, or creating issues related to depression. Disrupted or inconsistent schedules. Now, for again, a lot of our kids, without that, it's really hard. So that's when you see kids moping around and not necessarily having the energy to be productive. That's going to look like depression. Limited to no social opportunities. Dramatic increases in screen time. I think I mentioned this in one of the later slides, but I've read some things about the average screen time for a lot of kids in a lot of age groups is over 10 hours a day right now. Some of them is up to 12 hours. And if you start thinking about how many hours are we actually awake, that's startling numbers. So some of the impacts of depression, COVID on depression. Similar to anxiety. So some of the common diagnostic criteria that we think about, excessive distress and worry, insecure attachment, persistent reluctance to go out or leave the house. Now we're actually talking about kids that are not allowed to leave the house. Frequent somatic complaints, marked fear or anxiety about social situations, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, and again, irritability is synonymous, is also a symptom of anxiety like depression. So now if we look at, okay, in what ways has COVID impacted or led to increasing rates of anxiety? We're talking about daily news reports about the number of COVID deaths in our country. I understand why we're doing it, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but how is that going to impact anxiety and how people experience internal distress? When we talk about persistent reluctance to go out or leave the house, again, like I said, inability to go out and recommendations to remain in your house. That's going to, when we think about people that were potentially struggling with social anxiety, that's going to make things dramatically worse. Disconnection from social supports and extended family members. Daily reports about concerns related to contagion in gatherings of small or large groups. And again, there's this, the science is helping us make decisions, but those decisions are constantly changing. So as families, we're attempting to navigate that, and so are schools. Schools are trying to figure out, okay, make sure all of our desks are 6 feet apart. And now it's 3 feet apart. And some people, some educators, some families, some parents, and some children are not feeling comfortable with those changes. And we're questioning how much safer are we? Parents worry, so the degree to which parents worry in relation to their children is reflected in their daily language and behaviors. All dimensions of parental worry are significantly related to children's anxiety symptoms. The message there is not that parents aren't allowed to be anxious. The message to parents is be aware of your anxiety and know and anticipate how that's going to affect your children. Trauma, directly experiencing a traumatic event, these are the diagnostic criteria, witnessing the event as it occurs to others, learning that a traumatic event occurred to a family member. Sometimes kids who have experienced trauma tend to have a persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about themselves, persistent negative emotional state, markedly diminished interest or participation in activities, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. Again, even when I just read these aloud as part of the talk, I can't help but see how many of those diagnostic criteria are directly related to how kids are experiencing the COVID-19 world. Again, the first global pandemic in our collective lifetime, where kids and families and parents were literally watching the world shut down. Constant debates and confusion among the experts on how to manage the pandemic. And again, I don't personally care where you fit along that political continuum. I think we're all seeing the same thing, which is constant debates and disagreements. And so for kids, when we see constant debates and disagreement, that leads to stress. And that leads to traumatic reactions, to not knowing what to expect or not knowing the right way to respond to things like the pandemic. Social isolation, few opportunities to interact with others outside of our immediate family. directly related to that markedly diminished interest or participation. Again, home confinement, feelings of detachment or estrangement. Um, this is almost required in the pandemic. So again, direct correlation to some of these trauma related symptoms. So when we think about substance abuse, again, direct activation of the brain reward system, which is involved in the reinforcement of behaviors and the production of memories. We may, when we're struggling with substance abuse, we may neglect everyday responsibilities and activities. These kids seek out substance abuse, and so do adults, to produce feelings of pleasure, often referred to as high. So when do kids typically seek substances, or when are they seeking that high? When they can't get it elsewhere. So again, jump into the right side. When can kids not get it elsewhere? During a global pandemic. When they're socially isolated, they're confined to their homes, they're having difficulties experiencing pleasure more naturally. I can't tell you how many families and kids I've worked with where during the pandemic, they've dramatically increased their drug-seeking behaviors. Economic stress and loneliness are the primary drivers of substance abuse disorders, and they are both in full effect because of the because of the pandemic. General anxiety about the virus, maladaptive coping mechanisms. Again, that's kind of what substance abuse is. It's an unhealthy coping strategy. And a lot of kids, a lot of families who are struggling right now, this is what they're turning to. Limited physical activity and social interactions. Both of these are protective factors against substance abuse. I've had so many families tell me maybe their kid plays football and they're thinking the best thing about football is it's always keeping them busy. It's forcing them to be healthy. It's forcing them to be active. Take all of that away from a kid and not replace it with something else, you can understand why they might be looking to substance abuse to connect with others. ADHD and executive functioning, this is probably the easiest one. Kids who fail to pay close attention to details, difficulty sustaining their focus, don't seem to listen, don't always follow through on assignments, difficulty organizing tasks or activities. All of these things, what we're looking at with this Zoom world, including this presentation right now, kids that don't have their cameras on, kids that are playing video games during class time. These aren't bad kids. These are everybody's kids. I'm sure there are a few exceptions of those gold standard kids who are doing everything perfectly during remote learning. I'm yet to meet one. And I love my kids to death, but they're not perfect either. So we are creating these ADHD and executive functioning nightmares for kids. So when we go back to school and we're seeing these incredibly increasing rates of attention concerns, let's not forget about what we've asked kids to do for these last 12 months. Learning disabilities, difficulties learning to read, spell, written expression, mathematics. One of the criteria when we look to identify whether or not a kid has learning disabilities, we have to make sure they're not better accounted for by other factors, by psychosocial adversity or inadequate educational instruction. We can't do that for these last 12 months. And I'm not saying that I know firsthand that teachers have knocked themselves out trying to adjust to the demands of remote learning. I've seen some teachers doing some incredible things. I've seen teachers try and try and try again and struggle to engage kids via remote learning. Personally, as an instructor, I have struggled. I've had more failures than successes in terms of engaging kids remotely. So if you have kids that are in kindergarten through second grade right now, those critical years for learning how to read, it's likely that their reading progress has been disrupted. Upper elementary grades, when the shift is, again, reading is always important. But when we think about some of the executive functioning demands, written expression, organizing our written work, if our kids are in fourth, fifth, sixth grade right now, there are going to be significant gaps there. Math, most math curricula, they build on itself from year to year to year. So if your kid has been that significant disruption, depending where it's happened for your kid, you're going to see some of those gaps in math. Again, when we talk about psychosocial adversity or inadequate instruction, that's been the last 12 months. I don't care how great of a job we've done. It's been pretty much impossible to replicate in-person learning for kids. When we think about autism spectrum disorders, these are kids that have challenges with social communication, social interactions, limited social emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communication, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. These are all things that COVID has pretty much required or forced onto our kids. I've done so many evaluations where parents have said, my kid's really struggling social emotionally. He has no connections, no opportunities to meet new friends. Do you think he has autism? And I find myself thinking, well, maybe, but I also don't know what his opportunities have been like for these last 12 months. So I would hate to be making diagnostic decisions for any kid based on how they're presenting in these last 12 months. Because again, limited opportunities to experience social emotional reciprocity. So children who either have autism or somewhere on that continuum, these are all things that they've struggled with. So again, it's hard to say, is that something that's been a problem? Again, we're going to look back to how kids were functioning before it as well. So when I go through this list, I often think about Winnie the Pooh, and I don't know how many people know, but all these different characters, represent different mental health challenges. And I think a lot of people who have gone gone through these last 12 months with families and younger kids, you've probably felt like there have been days where your kid did have ADHD, when your kid was depressed, when your kid was anxious. How were they, to the extent that they're responding to COVID-19? Has this been a traumatic event for them? So if you've had kids that are, I think about, again, my most personal experiences, our seniors in high school who have been kind of robbed of their junior and senior year experiences, our athletes who have lost seasons, our students who have lost activities and, opportunities to engage in different clubs or competitions, our younger kids who have lost a lot of their social opportunities of early elementary school. I think it's reasonable to say that a lot of our families are really struggling in a lot of these ways. So if I think about, and I know we're going at 7:45, but I still think I have plenty of time to get through these. We'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. I'm not quite sure how successful the communication will be with technology, but I'm happy to stay on beyond 8 o'clock as well. These are what I think about as our top 10 list. So recommendations to parents. I guess I'm sharing these recommendations with you guys from a couple different perspectives. Again, as an educator and the clinical director of a program that has been open since early fall. So I've seen this again firsthand with my own 4 kids as they've tried to go back to school in different phases. And also as a psychologist who understands how mental health works. And I say understands in quotes because my understanding of mental health is always evolving. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I've done well over 1,000 evaluations of kids. I'm always learning from kids. I did an evaluation this morning. I learned more from that kid. And I met with the mother afterwards of the evaluation. I learned more from that conversation with the mom. But I feel pretty confident in these recommendations. One, change is slow and you need to be patient. Returning to normal will take time. It's going to take time for your kids. It's going to take time for you as parents. And it's going to take time for for educators, for schools. I can't tell you, hundreds and hundreds of hours working with school leaders, working with school-based teams, trying to prepare for the reopening. And I've never seen anything like it. Because typically these meetings with educators, you typically have experts sitting around the table. Who's my math expert? Who's my reading expert? Who's my mental health expert? Sitting around these, hundreds of hours talking about who's my pandemic expert? They're not there. Dr. Fauci's not joining our school-based teams to help us figure that out. And even these experts like Dr. Fauci will be the first one to say he's made tons of mistakes. So it's going to take time. Prioritize as a family what is most important to you. I'm never going to be one that preaches to parents what should be most important. But what I will say to parents is you should know what's most important to you. And your priorities are going to be different than mine. But figure out what your priorities are and make sure that's what you're emphasizing on as kids start to go back to school. Be patient when your kids struggle to adapt. So if they come back and they're having more social problems than usual, if they're having trouble sharing, and that's something they've already learned how to do in the past, but it's coming back up, don't be surprised. Some things that used to be easy might be more challenging now. In returning to normal will include mistakes. Your teachers are going to make mistakes. Your school leaders are going to make mistakes, just as you as parents are going to make mistakes. Don't be surprised and expect them. Reintroduce basic routines. Don't wait. Do it now. Those of you, the really proactive parents, you've probably been working on this for a while. Again, patterns and routines have been breaking down for over a year. You can't reintroduce them and expect them to happen overnight. Make sure your expectations are developmentally appropriate. If you have high school kids, who are struggling to get up again early, don't be surprised. Make routines concrete, especially for younger kids. So for those of you who can remember when your kids first started to go to kindergarten, and maybe you had a lot of visuals around to help them, don't forget your coat, don't forget your backpack, do all these things. You might have to do those again. You might have to do those again for 3rd and 4th graders. Middle school kids, using checklists and routines in ways that you thought you would never have to do again. You might have to make those things concrete again. Think about what allowed you to establish those healthy routines in the first place and do it again. And if you had ineffective routines prior to the pandemic, they're likely still going to be ineffective. So those are some ineffective routines that probably need to be changed anyways. So again, those are things that you probably want to anticipate having to change. Sleep hygiene and nutrition. To be fair, again, I made this joke as I was texting my kids before I prepared for the talk tonight. I have no idea what my kids are eating for dinner tonight. No idea. My wife's away tonight. My boys are home by themselves. I would assume they probably ordered Grubhub. We've had more of the fast food than we probably should have over the last 12 months. And I'm not telling you that you all of a sudden have to be beacons of health and perfect. But keep in mind that good, healthy meals are fuel for learning. Kids, what we know, kids that go to school with nutrition, with good breakfast, they're more ready for learning in the start of the day. Pay attention to those sleep habits. If your kids are sleeping, best case scenario, don't have kids, charging their phones at night in their bedrooms. When kids tell you, well, I need it for my alarm clock, get an alarm clock. There are other ways to do that. Sleep habits for kids are not in good shape right now. Kids are staying up later. Kids are waking up earlier. Kids are waking up in the middle of the night. That's why I say when I do my evaluations for kids, for families, I always ask parents, tell me about how your kid falls asleep. Do they stay asleep? And tell me about how they wake up. Those are things you want to look at, and those are things that you want to focus on. And there's no question in my mind, some of you as parents, you have probably prioritized sleep hygiene and nutrition right through the pandemic, which is phenomenal. It's excellent. It's what all of us should be doing. I think a lot of us, there's a lot of good reasons why some of these sleep and nutrition habits have probably slipped a little bit. So we want to restore those as best we can. I do like the quote, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. You don't want to say, screw it, I can't do it. I'm just going to bail and, not prioritize this because I can't keep up. Again, I just think as parents, we want to do a good job in these areas. Some parents will often ask me, like, what's a good bedtime for this age or this age or this age? It's always going to be different. You know your kids best. There's typically an hour or two range for our kids. As long as you're in that range, you're probably in good shape. As parents, as we look to this, you want to be anticipating obstacles. Kids are going to struggle. There are going to be gaps in learning. We're going to see changes in their mood. We're going to see increasing levels of behavioral or challenging behavior. Kids are going to have trouble waking up, and they're going to have trouble falling asleep. I've talked to a number of kids that are incredibly anxious about returning to school. Kids saying things like, there are half the kids in my class I haven't even met yet, which sounds crazy because we've never thought about that in April before. All of us as parents have worked really hard to prepare our kids for September and October. By April, those social concerns are usually long gone. Well, they're coming back. And I think it's great that so many kids are going to be going back to school full time throughout April. But as parents, be prepared to hear about social challenges that you haven't expected. Think about sports. Again, I'm a huge sports guy. My kids have played everything, nothing special, but we always participate. Be prepared for some obstacles there as well. How do they fit in with their team? Do they, are they lacking confidence in a way that they didn't used to lack confidence in before? And so many of our kids are learning all over again how important it is to fit in. And how do they do that? And when we don't fit in, what does that return to school mean for us? A lot of times it's going to mean a lot of social distress. When we think about, as a parent, preparing our kids for that return to normal, I highly recommend you take a strength-based approach. Whatever your kids' strengths are, celebrate them, leverage them. Don't take them away. If a kid's struggling to get back to school and they're making a few missteps academically, and let's say the thing that they're best at is lacrosse, and they're so excited to be part of their team and work with their friends, I know a lot of us as parents, some of our reaction is to take away some of those privileges until they start taking school more seriously. Personally, I don't think this is a time to do that. I think we want to build up our kids' confidence. It doesn't mean that they can blow off school and not do anything, but it means that we think being part of that team is a protective factor for them. So we're going to allow that to continue, and we're going to keep pushing them academically. We're going to keep raising that bar, but we're going to accept that sometimes the initial struggle is going to be there. Don't focus on your weaknesses, especially in the beginning. Again, there's going to be a huge focus on communication. I would say, as a psychologist, probably the number one thing I talk about with families always, whether it's whether I'm working with adults, whether I'm working with older kids, high school kids, middle school kids, elementary school kids, communication's key. There's nothing that we should be working on more. What we know about kids, what we know about adults and teachers and educators, unexpressed emotions are going to leak out in our behaviors. This is true for parents. It's true for kids. If we don't teach kids how to talk about their emotions, and we see it come out in their behaviors, we shouldn't be surprised. What effective communication practices do, they promote successful problem solving. So for parents, for educators, and for kids that have a hard time with problem solving, again, helping them talk through their problems is going to help them. It's going to increase their capacity for problem solving. For parents, communicate with your children and their teachers during the transition back to normal. Now, we want to be cognizant of how overwhelmed teachers are going to be over these next couple of weeks. But if your kids are struggling, if they're sharing things when they come back, again, homeschool communication is probably most strongest in the elementary grades, because that's when teachers, have so much focused time and energy with your kids. But even right through middle school and high school, make sure we're communicating. And then what sometimes parents forget about, one of the most important aspects of communication is listening. I'm listening to our kids' frustration, listening to what their challenges are. So when our older kids are a big thing for a lot of families right now, and again, I have a senior going through the college admission piece. A lot of kids are, not getting the results they were hoping for or expecting, or even the results that they would have gotten in every other year during this college admission process. Allow them to be upset. Allow them to talk to you about some of those challenges. It's going to be really important for them. Social learning theory, what this basically tells us is kids learn a lot more from what you do than from what you say. So pay attention, be aware. The kids are going to be looking to you to figure out how they should be feeling about returning to normal. So just like, for, decades and decades and decades, we've been talking to that parent who's dropping their kid off for the first day of kindergarten. The kid is watching how you drop them off, turn around, smile, and leave without turning back. That message to them is, you are someplace safe. You are going to be fine without me, and I can't wait to see you at the end of the day to hear about how great kindergarten was. For some of us as parents, that was harder. In allowing and celebrating that healthy attachment and separation was difficult. So as we look to return to school from the pandemic, kids are going to be watching us in the same way. Monitoring your language and in media exposure. This is a huge one. Again, the slide on the left, projected COVID-19 deaths by state. These slides are everywhere. Kids are flooded by social media outlets. Average screen time, like I said, over 10 hours a day for many age groups. To be fair to parents, I don't think we're doing much better. If you look around, you see people on their phones constantly. We have to find ways to do that. Focus on awareness and limitations. I'm not saying that kids shouldn't have phones. I'm not saying they shouldn't be using social media. I am saying that the tidal wave of social media has been nearly impossible for most kids to manage on their own. So we as parents, we want to be actively involved in that. Prioritize well-being. This is especially true during the pandemic, but it's always true. Kids need to feel safe. They need to feel secure and cared for in order to thrive in other aspects of their life. Make sure these needs are met first and then tackle other challenges. Well-being for you, your children, and your overall family system is going to be huge. And the last one, I kind of mentioned this earlier, disconnecting from technology. This is going to be hard. Programs like Yonder, this is what my program uses at BICO. Kids are expected to put their phones in pouches. The pouches have to be locked and they can't access them for the whole school day. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we have implemented Yonder without problems. It's a problem daily. Kids break the pouches, kids break into the phones. It's far from perfect. But what we know as educators, it's very hard to compete for kids' attention when we're competing against their phones. So we want to have practical expectations there. We want to think about how has technology been used to socialize during the pandemic, because there are some good things about technology. And again, finally, as parents, we need to practice what we preach. You've been a great audience. This is a really odd format. I'd much rather be seeing you all in person. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that another time. This is my email in the bottom left corner. So craigmurphy@fewcenter.com. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or concerns you might have. These are all the contact people from all of the different districts. So depending on where you're listening from, these are people you can reach out to and contact if you have any questions about other challenges related to returning to school for the remainder of the school year. I know there's one missing. Lori Cunningham from BICO is also the contact for BICO.